For 5 minutes. Could you not be yourself? For 5 minutes!
Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the latest in deck technology. And for today's deck tech, we're going to be taking a slightly different path than we normally do. Normally we don't talk about expensive decks like this, but I felt like going to the dark side today. How dark are we talking? Well, the deck is already mono black, but honestly, the deck is super duper expensive. So we're going to go all out today and see how many degenerate cards we can put into one single deck, but still find a way to make it slightly fair.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off.
What do I mean by that? Well, rather than continually talking about it right now, we're going to show off the deck for you. This is not going to be a super long in-depth deck because most of these cards I'm sure you've already encountered, and let's go ahead and show off today's deck that I'm simply calling Black Mirror. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content so you don't miss out on any of the gameplay, booster pack openings, deck decks, and so much more. Even though we're going to be doing a small deck tech today, we still need to talk about the most important thing, the stats of it, before we get into the meat of it. So our mono black deck is running an average damage curve of about 2.9, which is very high, but again, we are going to find a way to get through all of what we have. We're going to be rocking only 8 creatures in the deck, 4 instants, 17 sorceries, 4 artifacts, 3 planeswalkers, and 24 lands. Now, I'm sure one of my viewers out there is probably wondering right now, Infernoman, why would you put together such a disgustingly terrible deck?
Good question.
And truth be told, well,
I have no soul.
Actually, I got defeated by this deck before, so I wanted to put together myself and see how horrible can it really be. So obviously we're going to put together most of these cards that you probably have seen many times already if you're playing in historic rank. So most of this, of course, we're not going to go again in depth for. I just wanted to see how bad is it going to be. We're going to, of course, have some gameplay footage as I'm talking about the deck and show you, explain why this is such a disgustingly awful pile of cards. Starting in the 1-drop slot, we have Inquisition of Kozilek and we have Thoughtseize. Obviously, these cards need no introduction. They are your turn 1 plays where you're going to just start taking apart your opponent's game plan. Fatal Pushes, we have to have those, of course, for the early game threats. Just get rid of those. In the 2-drop slot, we have Orcish Bowmasters. Again, we really don't need to explain this card too much, but again, if you are living under a rock, this Orc Archer basically will start pinging our opponent whenever they draw an extra card besides the first one they draw in each turn, and we get to keep amassing Orcs 1. Amassing an army with this is extremely powerful, but also it provides an extra utility, which we'll talk about in just a second. In the 3-drop slot, we only have 3 cards that are all Liliana of the Veil. Obviously, similar to our Thoughtseizes Inquisitions, we start picking our opponent's hand apart, and then we can then -2 if we have to sacrifice a creature against them, especially if we have maybe like a one-on-one fight we just can't beat. The 4-drop slot is where all the real action takes place. So in the 4-drop slot, we have the One Ring, we have Beseech the Mirror, Yeleni's Expertise, Shieldred the Apocalypse, and our Wrath, Ritual of Soot. We have a Mastermind's Acquisition and an Extinction Event. Now, specifically, we're going to talk, of course, about the One Ring. Obviously, the card does not need any other additional introduction. We played this card, and I'm sure you've seen it many times over, but it's extremely powerful in our deck because we're also rocking, of course, Shieldred. Great synergies, really horrible to have both cards out, but of course, there is one specific reason why we are running so many 4-drops. We're, of course, rocking Beseech the Mirror. Let's talk about this card, since this is actually one we haven't discussed before. Beseech the Mirror is a 4-mana sorcery with the Bargain ability. Bargain basically means you can sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token as you cast the spell. Its main version says you search for a library for a card, you exile that card face down, and then shuffle. If the spell was Bargain, then you can cast the exile card without paying its mana cost if the spell's mana value is 4 or less. Otherwise, you put the exile card into your hand if it wasn't cast this way. Obviously, this means that's why we have so many 4-drops. We're trying to maximize the value of Beseech the Mirror. So with this card, you can sacrifice your extra copies of the One Ring so you don't ping yourself out. You can sacrifice that extra token of Orcish Bowmasters, so again, it gets additional value. Now, as for what we're stacking out, besides the copies of the One Ring, besides the Shieldreds that you can pull out, basically this, throwing it onto the battlefield for free, that's why we're also rocking 4-mana Wraths. Yeleni's Expertise is actually even more powerful in this build because
This is where the fun begins.
if you can cast this from a Beseech the Mirror, you can then Wrath the board, and Yeleni's Expertise basically means that you can cast a mana value spell of 3 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So you can actually kind of pseudo cascade, say Beseech the Mirror, sack, you then cast Yelene's Expertise. From there, maybe you can get a Liliana or an Orcish Bowmaster. Even if you have to in a pinch, even a Thoughtseize sometimes can save your bacon before your opponent can do anything. Otherwise, the other things that you can sack, as I just mentioned, we have those Wraths. Depending on what kind of go wide or go big decks our opponent has to deal with, we have Ritual Soot, of course, to destroy all creatures with mana value 3 or less, an Extinction Event where we can exile certain things that maybe we have a hard time with. Perfect world, we ideally want to go odd because Shieldred and Orcish Bowmaster and the token are mana values 0, 2, and 4. So keep that in mind if you're going to cast that. Otherwise, you'll notice that we have a single copy of Mastermind's Acquisitions, which you can also cast off from the Beseech the Mirror. Maybe a little awkward to do that, but think of, again, Mastermind's Acquisition as copy number 5 of Beseech the Mirror that also can flex into our toolbox sideboard that you probably might have noticed by now, but we'll go over that in just a second. Finally, in the 5-drop slot, we have Invoke Despair. I can tell you right now, I absolutely hate this card when I have to deal with it, but it's honestly a little hilarious when you get to do it, so that's us being evil for today. But in any case, Invoke Despair, since we haven't talked about this card, if you haven't seen it also, it's a 5-mana sorcery that reads, target opponent sacrifices a creature. If they can't, they lose 2 life and you draw a card. Then you repeat this process for an enchantment and a planeswalker. So obviously this can help us kind of clear the board in a weird kind of random way, but most likely you'll most get a creature out of it and be able to draw some action into it. Have this out with a Shieldred and you're basically going to destroy your opponent very quickly and swing the game in your favor. To round out the land package, we're going to have 20 swamps. I know there's a ton of utility lands you could use, but the reason why we're doing that is we also have a copy of Cabal Stronghold, so we can cast even more stuff with all the basic swamps that we have. Your actual only real essentials are going to be a single copy of Hive the Eye Tyrant for Graveyard Hate, Castle Lockway, and if you need instant Graveyard Hate, we also have a copy of Bajuka Bog. So those are basically going to be how you round out the main game plan. As I just mentioned earlier, we have that Mastermind's Acquisition, so what you can do is you can cast off from it the following. You can either have for Graveyard Hate Tormod's Crypt and Grafdigger's Cage, depending on what your opponent is doing. If you're trying to defeat certain Planeswalkers, you also have Pithing Needle, and you also have the Elder Spell for multiple Planeswalkers. If you're dealing with a lot of stuff that has hexproof or indestructible, you can turn it off, such as you can take out your opponent's One Rings if you just turn them off using Shadow Spear, and also this helps you stabilize because, again, it gives your creature trample and lifelink. If you're also trying to turn off any life gain decks out there, you also have Tainted Remedy, which then turns their life gain into life loss. Karn Silex can also force your opponent to not pay any life, so that means that gets turned off. And also it's a great pseudo-wrath, a little slower than others, but it also is very easy to use in that sense. Speaking of additional wraths, if we need more specialized wraths, maybe your opponent has a bunch of different creatures with different toughness, you also have Massacre Girl here. But if you need something that just needs to exile everything at the low end level, play Shadow's Verdict. This is an extremely powerful card, which can exile creatures and planeswalkers of a mana value of 3 or less from them and in the graveyard. In terms of slowing down those control decks out there, we have God Pharaoh's Statue, of course. If we need a little bit more stabilization, we have Platinum Angel and Wormcoil Engine. If we need to, we also have Cityscape Leveler to deal with any kind of non-land permanents, and also it creates for us a really powerful 8/8 that we can also use and unearth it if we have to in a pinch. And then the only other more specialized wraths, depending on what our opponent is playing, you also have Portal to Phyrexia. And to round it out, we have to have the one and only Meathook Massacre. Unfortunately, this card is a little nerfed in the historic format because of alchemy, of course, but that's okay. The card still does really great, so we can also utilize this in a pinch. But otherwise, my only other final thoughts on, as I played this deck, it is extremely powerful and extremely evil, but it still feels very fair because, again, you're not trying to combo off. You just want to play everything on curve to slowly strip out your opponents. So if you are a fan of fair magic like I am still, but also you absolutely want to play something still evil and disgusting, by all means, I would definitely recommend give this deck a try if you can afford it. For those of you out there who are interested in seeing me maybe try out some competitive decks, maybe you do want to see a much more in-depth, let me know in the comments below. Again, I'm going to mix and match sometimes with decks that maybe I don't feel like need a super long, lengthy explanation for, and maybe we could just do a little bit of more fun with the shorter decks out there for those of you out there who are looking for more short form content, similar to my midweek magic decks out there. But otherwise, my only other final thing I want to say is if you are a fan of mono black control in this form, if you do like playing some of the most expensive cards out there and flexing on your opponent, if you just want to make your opponent feel miserable, by all means, give this deck a try, and I assure you, once you drive them nuts with everything you're trying to do with some of the best cards in the format while still playing it fair and square, you will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.